Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. Fort Defiance, Arizona sits like a quiet prayer in the northeastern corner of the Navajo Nation, where the desert stretches endlessly beneath skies, so heavy with stars they seem to press down on you. My family's land lies just west of town, near Black Creek Wash, a place where the earth remembers everything, every footstep, every whispered prayer, every warning left unheeded. I'd been back from Afghanistan for 8 months. The transition to civilian life felt like trying to breathe underwater, possible, but never quite natural. My buddies from the service were struggling too. John, loud and brash, had returned from his third deployment with a chip on his shoulder and a bottle never far from his hand. Ty, quieter but steady, was working construction in Gallup and barely sleeping. Nathan had become a ghost of himself, jumpy and hollow-eyed. Chris seemed to be managing better than most, but I could see the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. Devin, the youngest of us at 23, was still trying to figure out who he was without a rifle in his hands. When I'd suggested a camping trip on my family's land that October, this was back in 2017, before any of us really understood how badly we needed help, they'd all jumped at the chance. A weekend away from the noise, from the expectations, from the well-meaning civilians who couldn't possibly understand. What I hadn't told them was that this land wasn't just land. My grandfather had taught me from the time I could walk that every rock, every wash, every twisted juniper tree held memory and power. There were rules here, old rules, and breaking them had consequences. The sun was sinking into the western horizon as we unloaded the trucks, painting everything in shades of copper and gold. The October air carried a coolness that would deepen into serious cold once darkness fell. I'd chosen a spot I knew well. A flat clearing ringed by juniper and pinyon, with good sight lines and the wash about 50 yards to the south. The fire pit was already there. Stones I'd stacked myself during summers home from high school, when this place had been my refuge. "This is perfect, man," Devin said, dropping his pack with a grateful grunt. His eyes swept across the landscape, and I saw him starting to relax for the first time in months. Absolutely perfect. John cracked open a beer and surveyed the area with the critical eye of someone who'd learned to assess terrain for threats. "Pretty exposed," he noted. "But I guess that's the point, right? See what's coming?" I felt that first twist of unease in my gut but pushed it away. "Nothing's coming," I said, more sharply than I'd intended. "It's just us in the desert." We spent the next hour setting up camp. 3 tents arranged in a loose semicircle around the fire pit. Coolers positioned near the trucks. Camp chairs unfolded. The familiar rhythm of it was soothing, reminding me of field exercises where at least we knew the parameters. Nathan kept humming under his breath, an old cadence from basic training, and Chris joined in. Soon we were all laughing, the sound carrying across the empty land. By the time full darkness fell, we had a good fire going. I'd brought mesquite wood that burned hot and clean, and the flames leapt and danced, pushing back the night. The whiskey came out, a bottle of decent bourbon that Ty had been saving, and we passed it around, the burn familiar and welcome. "To being alive," John said, raising the bottle before taking a long pull. "And to being somewhere we can't hear explosions." "I'll drink to that," Nathan muttered, accepting the bottle and drinking deep. The conversation flowed easily at first. We talked about nothing important. Sports, movies, women we'd known or wished we'd known better. Chris told a rambling story about a bar fight in 29 Palms that had everyone howling with laughter. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling upward into the vast darkness above. It was John who changed the mood. He'd been drinking steadily, and his face had taken on that flushed, reckless look I'd learned to recognize. The look that meant he was about to say something stupid. "So," he said, leaning forward with an exaggerated conspiratorial air, "are we going to talk about the elephant in the room? Or should I say the skinwalker in the room?" The words hit the air like a stone dropped into still water, and I felt the ripples of unease spread outward. Chris shifted uncomfortably. Ty's smile faded. Devin looked confused, and Nathan suddenly became very interested in the label on the whiskey bottle. "John," I said quietly, keeping my voice level. "Maybe we should—" "What?" he interrupted, that edge of belligerence creeping in. "Come on, man. We're out here in the middle of the res, sitting around a campfire. You're telling me we're not supposed to mention the big scary witch monsters? He made jazz hands mockingly. Ooh, spooky. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. Never speak lightly of what you don't understand. Words have power. Mockery invites attention you don't want. I'm serious, I said, and something in my tone made John pause. There are things out here that shouldn't be joked about. It's not superstition. It's respect. John snorted. Respect for what? Fairy tales? Stories bored sheep herders made up to scare their kids? He took another drink, shaking his head. I've seen real monsters, man. Human ones. They wear uniforms and plant IEDs and shoot at you from windows. That's what's scary. Not some bullshit about witches who turn into animals. John, seriously, shut up, Chris said softly. His face had gone pale, and he was staring out into the darkness beyond our ring of firelight. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, come on, John laughed, but it sounded forced now. Don't tell me you actually believe. The log in the fire exploded. The sound was like a gunshot, sharp and violent. We all jerked back instinctively, military reflexes kicking in even as our conscious minds processed that we weren't under attack. A chunk of burning wood flew from the pit, landing in the dirt near Ty's feet. He scrambled back, cursing, brushing embers off his jeans. Jesus, Devin yelped, his hand going reflexively to his hip where he no longer carried a sidearm. Nathan had actually thrown himself flat, and now he picked himself up slowly, embarrassed. Wet wood? He asked hopefully. But I knew better. I'd chosen that wood carefully, letting it season for months in my grandfather's shed. There was nothing wet about it. John forced a laugh, but his face had lost some of its cockiness. See? Even the fire thinks I'm hilarious. Nobody laughed with him. The mood had shifted. That easy camaraderie, evaporating like morning dew under harsh sun. We all felt it. That sudden awareness that we were very small and very alone in a very big darkness. The fire seemed dimmer somehow, its light not reaching as far as it had moments before. I found myself listening hard to the night around us. The desert is never truly silent. There are always sounds, always movement. The scratch of wind through dry brush, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of sand shifting. But now, straining my ears, I heard nothing. Absolute silence, as if every living thing for miles had suddenly decided to hold its breath. It's quiet, Chris said, voicing what we were all thinking. He'd pulled his legs up, boots resting on the edge of his chair, making himself smaller. Too quiet. It's fine, I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. It's just, when I was a kid, Chris interrupted, still staring into the dark. My grandmother told me stories. She grew up on the res in New Mexico, near Shiprock. She said her uncle saw one once, when he was young. Followed him for 3 nights. He said it looked like his cousin, walked on 2 legs wearing his cousin's clothes and his cousin's face, but the eyes, he trailed off, swallowing hard. She said her uncle was never right after that. Died young, in his 40s. Heart just gave out. Chris, I said gently, maybe we shouldn't. Earlier, he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. When we were unloading the trucks, I thought I saw something up on that ridge. He pointed to the dark mass of higher ground to our east. Something tall, too tall to be a coyote or a dog. It was just standing there, watching us. John opened his mouth, probably to say something dismissive, but Ty held up a hand, cocking his head. Wait, he said softly. Do you hear that? We all froze, listening. At first I heard nothing but the faint crackle of the fire and the rush of blood in my own ears. Then I caught it. A sound so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on gravel, circling somewhere just beyond the reach of our firelight. The steps would pause, then resume. Pause, then resume. Moving in an arc around our camp, maintaining the same distance. Never getting closer but never moving away either. Deer? Nathan whispered, but his voice shook. No, I said automatically. Deer don't move like that. Don't pace in circles like a predator assessing prey. Could be a coyote. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Whatever was making those sounds was big, and it was walking on 2 legs. John stood abruptly, and I saw his hand trembling slightly as he set down his beer. This is stupid, he announced to the group, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. I'm not going to sit here and let you guys spook yourselves over nothing. I'm going to take a leak, and when I get back, we're going to talk about literally anything else. John, I started, but he was already moving, deliberately loud, his boots crunching on the gravel. He walked toward the cluster of juniper trees where we'd parked the trucks, his form quickly swallowed by darkness. We heard him whistling, some country song I didn't recognize. The sound defiant and hollow in the vast night. Then the whistling stopped. He probably just went far enough for privacy, Devon said, but he didn't sound convinced. A minute passed, then another. The fire popped quietly and we all jumped. I found myself counting seconds in my head, the way I used to on patrol, waiting for the radio check that would confirm everyone was okay. 2 minutes, 3, 4. "John," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You good, man?" The silence that answered felt heavier than any I'd ever experienced. Not the absence of sound, but a presence of something else. Something that absorbed sound, that fed on it. "John," Nathan shouted, and the worry in his voice mirrored what we were all feeling. Nothing. No response. No sound of boots on gravel. No rustle of disturbed brush. No zipper or any of the other mundane sounds of a man relieving himself in the desert. Just silence. Ty was on his feet first, grabbing a flashlight from his pack. Chris handed me another, and Nathan took a third. The beams cut weak paths through the darkness, barely penetrating 10 feet ahead. Devon stayed by the fire, and I couldn't blame him. Someone needed to keep it going, and besides, the firelight felt like the only safe place in the world right now. "Stay close," I said quietly, "and for God's sake, stay together." We moved as a unit, the way we'd been trained, flashlights sweeping in overlapping arcs. John's boot prints were clearly visible in the dusty earth, a trail leading straight toward the juniper thicket. I could see where he'd walked, see the pattern of his soles pressed into the dirt. But about 20 feet from the trees, the prints changed. "Hold on," Ty said, crouching down. His flashlight played over the ground. "Look at this." John's prints continued forward, but alongside them now were other marks. Larger. Wrong. The impressions weren't quite footprints and weren't quite animal tracks. They were elongated, the toes spread too wide, with claw marks dragging in the dust. And they'd come from the side, parallel to John's path, matching his pace step for step. "What the hell?" Nathan breathed. "Keep moving," I said, because standing still felt worse than going forward. We reached the first juniper tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. The smell hit me first, something foul and organic, like meat left too long in the sun. My stomach clenched, and I had to fight not to gag. "John?" I called again, but my voice came out weak and uncertain. That's when we saw him. John was crouched behind one of the larger trees, hunched forward with his hands digging frantically into the dirt. His fingers were clawing at the earth with manic intensity, gouging deep grooves, his fingernails splitting and bleeding. But it was his face that made my heart stop. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated enormous, and they weren't focusing on anything in this world. He was staring at something beyond us, beyond the trees, something his mind was trying desperately to process and failing. His mouth moved constantly, words tumbling out in a rapid, barely coherent stream. Can't, not real, face, wrong, wearing face, not his face, eyes wrong. "John," Nathan said, reaching out slowly as if approaching a wounded animal. "John, buddy, it's us. We're here. What happened?" John flinched violently away from Nathan's hand, a sound escaping his throat that was more animal than human. His hands never stopped moving, digging, scratching, as if trying to burrow into the earth itself. "We need to get him back to the fire," I said, trying to sound authoritative despite the fear climbing up my spine. "Help me lift him." Ty and I grabbed John under his arms while Nathan kept the flashlight trained ahead. John came up unwillingly, his body rigid and trembling, his breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. His eyes never stopped staring at something behind us, something in the darkness between the trees. "It's following," John suddenly said clearly, his voice hoarse and terrified. "It's right there. Don't turn around. Please, God, don't turn around." Every instinct screamed at me to look, to see what had terrified John so completely. But my grandfather's voice spoke louder. "Never look directly at certain things. Your attention feeds them. Your acknowledgement gives them power. Eyes forward," I said to the others. "We're walking back to camp. We're not running, and we're not looking back. Understand?" Nathan and Ty nodded, their faces pale in the flashlight glow. The walk back felt endless. Each step seemed to take an hour, and John's weight pressed down on my shoulder like he was made of lead. He kept whispering the same thing over and over. Don't look back. Don't look back. It's wearing his face. It's wearing his face. Behind us I heard footsteps, not ours. Something else, matching our pace, staying just at the edge of the darkness beyond our flashlight beams. The sound was wrong, too measured, too deliberate, and under it I could hear breathing, slow, raspy, wet breathing that made my skin crawl. Keep walking, I said through clenched teeth. The smell intensified, that rotting meat stench mixing with something else, something chemical and sharp that burned my nostrils. Nathan gagged but kept moving. Ty's grip on John tightened, his knuckles white. Then Chris's voice cut through the darkness ahead. Hurry up, something's wrong. We burst back into the firelight like drowning men breaking the surface. Devon was standing rigid by the fire, his face drained of color, staring out into the darkness to the south. Chris had grabbed a thick branch from the woodpile and was holding it like a club. What happened? I asked urgently, as we lowered John into one of the camp chairs. Something was in the tents, Devon said, his voice shaking. I heard it moving around in there, breathing. But when I went to look, there was nothing. Just, he gestured helplessly. The smell. Did you smell it? We all had. That putrid, nauseating odor still clung to us, to our clothes, to the inside of my nose and mouth. John curled into himself in the chair, arms wrapped tight around his knees, rocking slightly. His lips continued moving in that constant stream of half-words, his eyes fixed on something beyond the firelight that the rest of us couldn't see. Chris handed me his pack. There's cedar and cornmeal in the side pocket. Your grandfather gave it to me last time I visited, said to keep it with me. I didn't understand then, but I didn't let him finish. Just grabbed the pouch and moved to the fire. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The cedar went into the flames first, and smoke rose immediately, thick and pungent. The smell was clean, sharp, cutting through that terrible rotting odor like a blade. We need to keep the fire going, I said, hearing the tremor in my own voice and hating it. No matter what happens, we don't let it die. Understand? They all nodded, even John, though his eyes remained distant and haunted. Ty threw more wood on the fire, and the flames leapt higher, pushing back the darkness by a few more precious feet. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe the cedar would work. Maybe we'd be safe if we just stayed in the light until morning. Then Devon said, "Oh God, look." He was pointing to the ridge, the same ridge where Chris had seen something earlier, and there it was, silhouetted against the star-heavy sky. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing motionless on the high ground. It was too far away to make out details, but something about its proportions was fundamentally wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, the head tilted at an angle that made my stomach turn. Don't stare at it, I said quickly. Look away. Everyone, look at the fire, not at... There's another one, Nathan interrupted, his voice tight with panic. Over there by the wash. I caught a glimpse from the corner of my eye, another shape, this one closer, standing at the edge of our firelight. It shifted position smoothly, fluidly, in a way that hurt to watch. How many? Chris asked. I don't know, I said. Stop looking for them. But it was too late. We'd all seen them now, and once you'd seen them, the breathing sound intensified, coming from multiple directions now, and under it something else, a sound like whispers, or maybe laughter, or maybe both. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was mocking, cruel, delighted. John suddenly lurched forward in his chair, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. His eyes were clearer now, and that made it worse somehow, seeing the absolute terror in them, raw and unfiltered. I saw it up close, he said, his voice cracking. When I was out there, it came up behind me, and I turned around, and... He stopped, swallowing hard, his whole body shaking. It was wearing someone's face, someone's skin, but it didn't fit right. The eyes were too big, too far apart, and the mouth, when it smiled. He made a sound that might have been a sob, or might have been a laugh. Too many teeth. All wrong, all backwards. John, don't, I said, but he wouldn't stop. It spoke to me. It sounded like my brother. It knew things only he would know, things from when we were kids, private things. But my brother's been dead for 2 years, and this thing was wearing his voice like a costume, and it wasn't quite right, like a recording played at the wrong speed. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks. In the brief flare of light, I caught sight of movement in the darkness. Quick, darting shapes that might have been animals, or might have been something else entirely. Nathan was breathing too fast, on the edge of hyperventilating. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. We're staying calm, I said firmly, though calm was the last thing I felt. We're staying together. We're keeping the fire burning, and we're making it to sunrise. That's all we have to do. How long until sunrise? Devon asked in a small voice. I checked my watch. The numbers glowed faintly. 11:47 p.m. About 7 hours, I said. 7 hours. It might as well have been 7 years. The hours that followed blurred together into a nightmare that felt both endless and impossibly fast. Time stopped behaving normally. Minutes would stretch like taffy. Then suddenly whole blocks of time would vanish, leaving me disoriented and uncertain how much darkness we still had to endure. We formed a loose circle around the fire, backs to the flames, each of us watching a different direction. Every few minutes, someone would add more wood to the fire, and we'd all breathe a little easier as the light flared stronger. The cedar continued to smolder, sending up its protective smoke, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a partial barrier, enough to keep them at a distance, but not enough to make them leave entirely. The shapes on the ridge multiplied. At first there had been 2, then 3, then more than I wanted to count. They stood motionless for long periods, then would suddenly shift position when we weren't quite looking, moving impossibly fast, appearing in new locations without seeming to cross the space between. They're getting closer, Chris said at one point, his voice steady but strained. Each time they move, they're a little closer. He was right. What had started as distant silhouettes on the horizon were now close enough that I could make out details I wished I couldn't see. Their movements were fluid but wrong, joints bending in directions that defied anatomy. Sometimes they walked upright. Sometimes they dropped to all fours, loping with that terrible, efficient gait of a predator. The sounds never stopped. The breathing, that slow, raspy breathing, came from all directions now, sometimes close enough that I could feel the displacement of air on the back of my neck. The whispers ebbed and flowed like tide, and occasionally I thought I could almost make out words, almost understand what they were saying, but trying to focus on it made my head hurt, made my vision swim, so I learned to let it wash over me without really listening. Around 1 a.m., Nathan suddenly jerked upright. "Did you hear that?" he demanded. "Did you hear it?" "Hear what?" Ty asked. "My name. Someone just whispered my name. It sounded like..." He stopped, his face going pale. "It sounded like my mother. But she's in Phoenix. She's not here. She can't be here." "Don't respond to it," I said quickly. "Don't acknowledge it." But Nathan was already on his feet, turning toward the darkness where the sound had come from. "Mom," he called out, his voice breaking. "Is that you?" "Nathan, sit down," I ordered, reaching for his arm. He shook me off. "I heard her. She needs help. It's not your mother," I shouted, grabbing him harder. "It's trying to get you to walk away from the fire. Don't you understand? It's mimicking her voice." The words hit him like a slap, and he staggered back, the terrible understanding dawning on his face. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, it knows her voice. How does it know her voice?" I didn't have an answer to that, but my grandfather had warned me once. They know things they shouldn't know. They can reach into your mind and pull out what matters most, then use it against you. Around 2 a.m., Devon started crying. Not sobbing, just quiet tears streaming down his face as he stared into the darkness. "I can see them," he said softly. "I can see their eyes. There are so many eyes, all watching us." I followed his gaze and immediately wished I hadn't. He was right. The darkness beyond our firelight was filled with reflections. Eyes catching and throwing back the firelight, arranged at wrong heights, too high or too low to be any normal animal. And they were patient. They would watch for long minutes without blinking, without moving, just waiting. Ty had stopped speaking around 3 a.m. He sat rigid in his chair, hands clenched on his knees, staring straight ahead with an intensity that worried me. Every so often his lips would move silently, and I realized he was praying. I wanted to tell him to pray louder, to pray for all of us, but something kept the words trapped in my throat. John had retreated somewhere inside himself. His eyes were open but vacant, and that constant stream of whispered words had finally stopped. The silence from him was somehow worse than the frantic rambling had been. I kept checking to make sure he was still breathing, still present in some minimal way. Around 4 a.m., though I'd stopped trusting my watch by then, time having become slippery and unreliable, Chris grabbed my shoulder hard enough to hurt. "Something's wrong with the fire," he said. I looked and saw what he meant. The flames were burning as high as ever, the wood consumed at the normal rate, but the light wasn't reaching as far as it should. The darkness was pressing in, somehow thicker and more substantial than regular night, resistant to the firelight in a way that violated basic physics. "More cedar," I said, and Chris grabbed the pouch with shaking hands. As he sprinkled it over the flames, one of the shapes at the edge of our light darted forward, quick as thought, there and gone in a heartbeat. But I'd seen it clearly for that split second. Tall, emaciated, with limbs that bent wrong and a face that was almost human but not quite, stretched too long like warm wax pulled by invisible hands. "They're testing us," Ty said suddenly, his first words in over an hour. "Seeing how close they can get." He was right. Over the next hour, they made quick forays toward our circle, never quite entering the firelight but getting closer each time. Testing the barrier of cedar smoke and flame, looking for weaknesses. Devon suddenly pointed at one of the tents. "The zipper," he said. "It's moving." We all watched in horror as the tent zipper slowly opened from the inside, pulled by something we couldn't see. The fabric bulged outward as if something large was pressing against it from within. But we all knew that there was nothing in that tent. We'd checked, multiple times. The zipper reached the bottom, and the tent flap fell open. For a moment nothing happened. Then a smell rolled out, that same putrid, rotting meat odor, but worse now, concentrated and overwhelming. "Don't look at it," I said. But we were all looking, unable to stop ourselves. Something moved inside the tent. Not something coming out, but something moving around in there, making the walls bulge and shift. Then, impossibly, I heard my own voice coming from inside. "Come on, guys. It's safe in here. The fire can't help you anymore." My skin crawled. Hearing your own voice say things you never said, words formed by something that wasn't you, it violated something fundamental about identity, about self. "That's not me," I said unnecessarily. "Don't." "We know." Chris cut me off. "We know it's not you." The voice came again, still wearing my inflection, my speech patterns. "John saw me. He saw what's really out here. Do you want to see too? Do you want to understand?" John whimpered, a broken sound that made my heart ache. Then, mercifully, the eastern sky began to lighten. The change was subtle at first, just the faintest lessening of the absolute darkness, a shift from black to the deepest navy blue, but it was enough. The whispers faded like smoke, the breathing sounds grew distant and then stopped altogether. The eyes in the darkness blinked out one by one. We watched in exhausted silence as dawn approached, none of us quite believing that we'd made it, that the night was finally ending. The shapes on the ridge held their positions longest, silhouettes against the gradually brightening sky. Then, as the sun's first rays touched the horizon, they simply weren't there anymore. Not retreating, not walking away, just gone as if they'd never existed. The tent zipper was still open. In the growing light, I could see that the interior was undisturbed, sleeping bags neatly arranged, gear where we'd left it. No evidence that anything had been inside, but the smell lingered, faint but unmistakable. As full daylight washed over the land, color and detail returning to the world, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to release. My body ached everywhere, muscles cramped from hours of rigid alertness. My eyes burned with exhaustion and strain. John stirred first, lifting his head slowly like someone waking from a coma. His eyes moved across the camp, seeing the fire reduced to coals, the empty landscape around us, his friends all staring at him with concern. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face. Then memory flooded back, and he groaned, burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't believe. I didn't." "Don't," I said quietly. "Not now. Let's just." The sound of an approaching vehicle cut me off. Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt lightheaded. I knew that engine sound, had known it my entire life. My grandfather's faded blue Ford pickup appeared down the dirt road, moving slowly, trailing dust. He'd been up at his winter place in the Chuska Mountains, wasn't supposed to be back for another week. But somehow he'd known, somehow he'd understood that we needed him. He climbed out slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of his 78 years. His face was weathered and lined, his long gray hair pulled back in a traditional bun. He wore a faded denim shirt and jeans, work boots caked with red dirt. His eyes were sharp as obsidian, taking in every detail of our camp, of us, of the marks in the dirt beyond our fire. He didn't greet us, didn't ask what happened. He simply moved to the fire pit, pulling items from a worn leather bag he carried. Cedar, cornmeal, other things I couldn't identify. He knelt with some difficulty, his knees protesting, and began to build up the fire again. Then he began to chant. The words were old, in a dialect I only partially understood. They rolled out low and steady, filling the morning air with their power. He sprinkled the herbs and meal into the flames according to patterns I recognized from ceremonies I'd witnessed but never participated in. Smoke rose, different from regular wood smoke, thicker, whiter, carrying a scent that was clean and sharp and safe. We watched in silence, none of us moving. Even John had stopped shaking, his attention fixed on my grandfather's careful, precise movements. The chant continued, rising and falling in rhythmic waves, and I felt something shift in the air around us, a lightening, a releasing, as if invisible weights were being lifted. After what might have been 15 minutes or might have been an hour, my grandfather fell silent. He sat back on his heels, breathing deeply, then slowly stood. Only then did he look at us directly. His eyes found me first, and I saw disappointment there that cut deeper than any anger could have. "You knew better," he said simply. Shame flooded through me, hot and bitter. "Grandfather." He held up a hand, stopping me. His gaze moved to John, who couldn't meet his eyes. "You mocked what you don't understand," my grandfather said. "You invited attention that should never have been drawn. Words have power, young man, especially words spoken without respect on land that remembers everything." "I didn't know," John said hoarsely. "I'm sorry. I didn't—" "Ignorance is not protection," my grandfather interrupted gently but firmly. "But your apology is noted." He looked at each of us in turn. "What you experienced last night was real. Not hallucination, not group panic, not tricks of darkness and tired minds. Real. You understand?" We all nodded, unable to speak. "Good. Because understanding is the first step toward healing. Some of you," his eyes lingered on John, "will carry marks from this night for the rest of your lives. Some wounds don't heal. They just learn to be born." He turned back to me. "Pack up. Leave this place. The land will settle in time, but you've disturbed something that needs space to rest again." "Will it follow us?" Devin asked in a small voice. My grandfather considered this. "Not if you follow the rules I'm about to give you. Not if you show proper respect from here forward." He reached into his bag and pulled out small pouches, handing one to each of us. "Keep these with you. Cedar and pollen. Blessed and prepared correctly. Don't open them. Don't lose them. When you feel watched, when you hear things that aren't quite right, hold them and remember that not all power is malevolent. Some is protective." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "You boys fought in a war. You've seen terrible things. Done terrible things, perhaps. The world has sharp edges, and you've been cut by them. But there are older powers than human violence. Older rules than military orders. You learned that last night. Don't forget it." He climbed back into his truck without another word. The engine started, and he began to turn around. Then he paused, leaning out the window. "And boy," he called to John, "don't ever mock what you can't see again. Next time the cedar might not be enough." The truck drove away, leaving us standing in the morning sun, clutching our pouches like lifelines. We packed in silence, moving mechanically. Nobody wanted to talk about what had happened, but nobody could think about anything else. The tents came down. Gear was stowed. The fire pit was carefully buried. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, unable to shake the feeling of being watched even in full daylight. John was the worst off. His hands shook so badly he could barely grip anything. Ty helped him pack his gear while Nathan and Chris loaded the trucks. Devin kept touching his pouch of cedar and pollen like a rosary, his lips moving in silent prayer, or maybe just repetitive reassurance. "I'm heading back to Gallup," Ty said as we secured the last of the equipment. "Taking John with me. He needs to see someone, talk to someone who understands." He lowered his voice. "Think your grandfather would be willing?" I nodded. "I'll call him. He'll know what to do." But even as I said it, I wondered if there was anything to do. Some experiences can't be talked away, can't be explained or processed or filed neatly into the past. They live in you, changing the way you see the world, the way you move through it. We stood by the trucks, none of us quite ready to leave despite our eagerness to be gone from this place. The morning was beautiful. Clear sky, crisp air, the desert showing its softer face. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful scene with the nightmare of the previous night. "We don't talk about this," John said suddenly. His voice was rough, damaged. "Not to anyone. Nobody would believe us anyway. They'd think we were crazy, PTSD hallucinations or something." "John," I started. "No," he cut me off. "I'm serious. What would we even say? That we got spooked by some—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm going back to New Mexico. My folks are in Albuquerque. I need to be around people. Lots of people. Somewhere with lights and noise and nothing to do with any of this." He climbed into Ty's truck and didn't look back. Chris left next, making vague plans about visiting family in Oregon. "I need to be around trees," he said. "Real forests, not desert. Somewhere that doesn't feel so empty." He gripped my shoulder hard. "Thank your grandfather for me. The cedar, it helped. I felt it." Nathan and Devin carpooled, heading back toward Gallup and then who knew where. Devin was talking about staying with his sister in Flagstaff. Nathan just looked exhausted, hollowed out. I was the last one there, standing alone by my truck as dust from their departure settled slowly. The land was quiet again, peaceful again, showing no evidence of what had transpired. But I knew the marks were there, invisible but indelible, written into the fabric of this place. I thought about calling my grandfather, asking him more questions, but I knew he'd said everything that needed saying. The rest was for me to figure out, to carry, to live with. As I climbed into my truck, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Just a flicker, gone when I turned to look directly. Maybe nothing. Maybe a lizard or a bird. Maybe something else. Still watching, still waiting. I started the engine and drove away without looking back. The weeks that followed were strange and difficult. I tried to return to normal life, to the rhythms of civilian existence, but everything felt off-kilter, slightly wrong. Sounds were too loud or too quiet. Darkness felt oppressive in ways it never had before. I found myself avoiding windows at night, couldn't sleep without a light on. John disappeared completely. Ty reported that he'd made it to Albuquerque, but after that the trail went cold. No returned calls, no responses to texts. It was like he'd decided to erase that part of his life entirely, including everyone connected to it. Chris sent a single text from Oregon. "Made it. Staying here. Don't try to find me. Need distance from all of it." Then nothing. Devin lasted a week in Flagstaff before having some kind of breakdown. His sister called me, asking what had happened, what we'd experienced that night. I couldn't tell her. What words could possibly convey it? I gave her my grandfather's number instead, hoping he could offer some comfort or understanding. Only Nathan stayed in regular contact. We'd meet for coffee sometimes, always in bright, busy places. Starbucks, diners, anywhere with lots of people and fluorescent lights. We never talked about that night directly. Instead, we'd dance around it, sharing oblique references and careful updates. "I saw something last week," he told me one afternoon. We were in a Denny's in Window Rock, surrounded by the clatter of dishes and the chatter of other diners. Not like that night, nothing that clear, but I was walking to my car after dark, and I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there, but the footsteps kept going for 3 more steps, like whatever it was hadn't stopped yet. I nodded, understanding completely. I'd had similar experiences, shadows that moved wrong, whispers in empty rooms, the persistent feeling of being watched by something that meant me harm. "The pouch helps," Nathan continued, touching the pocket where he kept his grandfather's gift. "When it gets bad, I hold it and remember that we made it through. That counts for something, right?" "Right," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. My grandfather visited me 3 weeks after that night. He came to my apartment in Fort Defiance, bringing food and tobacco and a calm presence that I hadn't realized I desperately needed. We sat on my small patio, watching the sun set over the desert, not talking for a long time. Finally, he said, "You're carrying it with you. The experience, it's heavy." I nodded, unable to find words. "This is the burden of knowledge," he continued quietly. of understanding that the world is larger and stranger than most people know. Your friends who went to war, they learned one kind of hard truth. That night, you all learned another kind. Both truths are real. Both leave marks. Does it get easier? I asked. He considered this carefully. Not easier. But you learn to live with it. You learn which rules to follow, which boundaries not to cross. You learn respect, not from fear, though fear is part of it, but from understanding. The land, the old powers, they're not evil. They're simply other, operating by different rules than humans use. When we forget that, when we push into spaces we don't belong or mock what we don't understand, he shrugged. Consequences follow. John just wanted to blow off steam, I said. He didn't deserve. Deserve has nothing to do with it, my grandfather interrupted gently. This isn't about punishment or justice. It's about action and reaction, cause and effect. He spoke carelessly. The land responded. Simple as that. It doesn't feel simple. No, he agreed. It rarely does. He stayed for dinner, telling me stories from his youth. Not scary stories, but teaching stories about living properly on this land, about respecting what came before and what would come after. When he left, he pressed another pouch into my hands, this one larger than the first. For your home, he explained. Hang it above your door, and listen, really listen, when the land speaks. It's not always warning, sometimes it's just teaching. 3 months later, I ran into Nathan at a gas station. He looked better, less haunted, more grounded. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important. Then he said, I'm thinking about moving, maybe Montana or Wyoming, somewhere with different land, different energy. Running away? I asked, not unkindly. He smiled. A real smile this time. More like starting fresh. I'll always respect what I learned. Always follow the rules your grandfather taught us. But I need space from the specific land where it happened. Does that make sense? It did. I told him so and wished him well. 6 months after that night, Devin called me. It was late, almost midnight, and my first instinct was panic that he'd seen something, experienced something new and terrible. But his voice when I answered was calm. I wanted you to know I'm doing better, he said. I've been working with a medicine man here, someone your grandfather recommended. He's been helping me understand what happened, how to process it, and I wanted to say thank you. For what? I asked, genuinely confused. For keeping us alive that night. For knowing what to do. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't known the rules, he trailed off, we'd be dead, or worse than dead, so thank you. After he hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about that night and the night since, about the weight of knowledge and the price of understanding, about the friends I'd tried to help who had scattered to the winds, each carrying their own version of that experience. The pouch from my grandfather hung above my door, exactly where he'd told me to place it. The smaller one stayed in my pocket. Always. I'd learned to listen to the subtle warnings, the too quiet nights, the shadows that moved wrong, the whispers at the edge of hearing. I'd learned which places to avoid, and which times were safer than others. But most importantly, I'd learned what my grandfather had been trying to teach me my whole life. That respect isn't just politeness. It's recognition of power. Power that exists outside human understanding or control. Power that was here before us and will remain after we're gone. The desert stretched wide outside my window, peaceful and beautiful in the moonlight. But I knew what moved in those spaces between juniper trees and sandstone cliffs. I knew what watched from the ridges, and what breathed in the darkness, and I would never ever forget. Sometimes, late at night when sleep is slow to come, I think about John. I wonder where he is, whether he found peace, or whether that night broke something in him that could never be repaired. I think about Chris in his Oregon forests and Nathan in whatever northern land he'd chosen, and Devin working through his trauma with a medicine man's help. We'd gone into that night as soldiers, men who thought we understood fear and danger. We'd come out as something different, witnesses to power we couldn't explain, carriers of knowledge we couldn't share. The land remembered what we'd experienced. The land always remembers. And so would we for the rest of our lives. Outside my window, a coyote called a real one, I was pretty sure. The sound was wild and lonely, echoing across the desert night. I listened until it faded, then checked the locks on my doors and windows one more time before heading to bed. The pouch stayed in my pocket, It would always stay in my pocket. Some lessons once learned can never be unlearned. I accepted the seasonal maintenance position at Canyon de Chelly in late May of 2016 to earn extra money and escape Phoenix's brutal summer heat. 24 years old and restless, I figured 3 months of trail work would be straightforward. Clear debris after storms, repair damaged sections, maintain the footpaths before tourist groups arrived each morning. The pay wasn't spectacular, but the solitude appealed to me more than I wanted to admit. The canyon itself was more impressive than any photograph suggested. Vertical sandstone walls rose 800 feet in places, their surfaces painted with streaks of desert varnish that marked centuries of water flow. The colors shifted throughout the day: rust red in morning light, deep amber by afternoon, purple shadows at dusk. Once you descended from the rim and walked far enough along the canyon floor, civilization felt impossibly distant. The road above, the parking areas, the visitor center, all of it ceased to exist in any meaningful way. By the third week of July, I had learned the canyon's patterns. Monsoon storms rolled in during afternoon hours, building rapidly from seemingly clear skies. Within 20 minutes, the temperature would drop 15 degrees, wind would howl through the narrow passages, and rain would hammer down with enough force to strip loose soil from the trails. Flash floods were the real danger. A storm miles away could send a wall of water through the washes without warning, turning calm sandy bottoms into churning rapids in seconds. The protocol was clear: never work alone after heavy rain. The ground became treacherous, unstable, unpredictable. But that summer, staffing was thin. 2 people had quit without explanation in early July, and another had transferred to a different park. When the White House Ruin Trail needed inspection before morning tours, there simply wasn't anyone available to pair with me. My supervisor, Thomas Bigay, handed me the radio at 6 in the morning. The storm had passed through sometime after midnight, and the trail reports from the rim suggested significant damage. "Check for washouts on the main route," he said, his weathered face showing concern. "Mark anything that needs repair crew attention. Keep the radio on channel 3. I shouldered my pack, checked my water supply, and started down. The descent took longer than usual. Even early morning brought no relief from humidity, and the air felt thick, pressing against my skin. Mud covered sections of the trail, grabbing at my boots with surprising strength. I worked slowly, methodically, making notes about damaged areas, moving branches that had fallen across the path, pushing loose rocks away from the switchbacks where hikers would walk in a few hours. The smell was distinctive after rain in the desert. Wet sandstone gave off an earthy mineral scent, while creosote bushes released their sharp cleansing aroma. But underneath that, something else lingered: stagnant water, decaying vegetation, the peculiar mustiness of mud that had been churned and rechurned by multiple storms. Sound behaved strangely in the canyon. Water dripped from crevices in the walls, creating echoes that bounced and multiplied until it seemed like rain was still falling. My own footsteps sounded too loud, then too quiet, then impossibly close to my ears. The radio hissed occasionally with static, but no voices came through. The walls were too high here, blocking transmission. An hour into the inspection, the trail narrowed. The walls pressed inward, creating a corridor barely 15 feet wide. The floor was almost entirely mud, deep enough in places that I sank past my ankles. A large boulder marked the bend ahead, water-stained and surrounded by debris from the storm. That's where I saw him. A man crouched near the boulder, hunched forward, one arm wrapped across his midsection. He wore a faded denim jacket, soaked dark in patches, and jeans that were caked with reddish-brown clay. His head was bent so far forward that his chin nearly touched his chest. He didn't move as I approached. "Hey," my voice bounced off the walls, returning fractured and strange. "You okay?" Silence. Not even a shift in posture to acknowledge my presence. I moved closer, boots squelching in the mud. "The trail's closed for maintenance. How did you get down here?" Still nothing. Water dripped from his jacket, forming small pools in the mud around his feet. His hands were visible now, pale skin, fingers slightly curled, covered in the same reddish clay that coated everything after the storm. Then he stood up. The movement was wrong from the first instant. His arms swung forward as if pulled by invisible strings, extending too far before his legs straightened to catch up. The motion had no natural flow to it. No smooth transition from crouch to standing. It looked mechanical, disjointed, like watching someone manipulate a marionette with tangled strings. He turned his head toward me. The rotation was too slow, too deliberate, and it continued past the point where it should have stopped. His shoulder remained stationary while his face kept turning, showing me his profile at an angle that made my stomach tighten. A sound came from his chest. Not words, but a deep exhalation, thick and wet, as if he were forcing air through liquid. The sound rattled and bubbled, then cut off abruptly. I stopped moving. Every instinct screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with what I was seeing. This wasn't injury. This wasn't hypothermia or shock or any medical emergency I could rationalize. The way he stood, the unnatural angles of his joints, the sound of that breathing, none of it fit. He took a step toward me. His foot dragged through the mud, lifting too late, setting down too hard. The other foot followed with the same jerking motion. But despite the awkwardness, he was covering ground. The mud that should have been slowing him down seemed to have no effect. I backed up, keeping my eyes locked on him, feeling behind me with one boot before committing my weight. The radio was in my pack, but reaching for it meant taking my attention away from him, and that thought filled me with dread. He kept coming. Same uneven gait. Same forward-leaning posture that suggested he might topple over at any moment. But he didn't. He just kept walking, each step bringing him closer. The canyon stretched ahead of me, 2 miles at least, before the loop would bring me back toward any rim access point. Behind me lay the damaged footbridge over the wash's side channel, the planks broken and unsafe. That meant detouring to the alternate climb point near Junction Ruin, adding 5 miles to my route. I turned and started walking faster. Behind me, I could hear his boots splashing through mud puddles, irregular but persistent. The sound of his breathing carried between splashes, that same thick, wet rattle that didn't match the steady pace of his steps. The canyon floor had become an obstacle course. Storm runoff channeled toward the main wash, leaving ankle-deep mud in some stretches and rushing streams in others. Small waterfalls emerged from cracks in the canyon walls, feeding into channels that cut across the trail. Every time I slowed to navigate a difficult section, I expected to hear him closing the distance. The fear of that, of turning and finding him right behind me, made my hands shake and my breathing shallow. I pulled the radio free while walking, pressed the call button. Static hissed back at me, meaningless. The canyon walls rose too steeply here for any signal to reach the rim. I shoved it back into my pack and kept moving. A mile in, the trail entered a section where the walls pressed so close together that my shoulders nearly brushed both sides. The floor was covered with loose rock fragments mixed with slippery clay. My boots skidded with each step, forcing me to slow down even though every nerve in my body screamed to move faster. I looked back. He was closer, maybe 30 yards now. Still not running. I hadn't seen him break into anything faster than that strange jerking walk, but the gap was narrowing. His head remained tilted at that wrong angle, and even from this distance I could hear the wet sound of his breathing echoing off the walls. Panic started creeping in around the edges of my thoughts. I forced it back, focused on the trail ahead, tried to remember every detail from the maps I'd studied. The alternate climb point was still at least a mile away. The trail would funnel me straight toward it with no alternate routes. If he kept following, I would have to outpace him the entire way. The worst section came without warning. Storm runoff had carved a shallow trench through the trail, and the bottom was filled with mud that grabbed at my boots like living hands. Each step required pulling my entire leg free with enough force that my thigh muscles burned within minutes. Behind me, the splashing continued. Irregular rhythm, but too quick for someone who should have been struggling through the same conditions. The sound was getting closer. I pushed harder, legs screaming, sweat mixing with the grit and dust that clung to my face. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my vision started narrowing at the edges. Somewhere in my memory, fragments surfaced from conversations with the Navajo maintenance crew I'd worked alongside earlier in the season. They'd been careful with their words, speaking around subjects rather than addressing them directly. But one evening, one of them had mentioned something, not quite a warning, but close, about things that weren't what they appeared to be, about the importance of not acknowledging certain encounters, of moving away without confrontation. At the time, it had sounded like folklore. Now, with that thing following me through the mud and those wrong-angled joints and that breathing, it didn't seem like a story anymore. The canyon walls began to change. The flat mud gave way to angled sandstone, grooved and carved by water. According to the maps, the emergency climb point started somewhere ahead. A steep ascent meant for rangers, not tourists, rising sharply toward the rim. I forced myself to slow down enough to check behind me one more time. He was 40 yards back. Same gait, same posture, but his breathing had gotten louder, that wet rattling sound bouncing off the canyon walls until it seemed to come from everywhere. The base of the climb appeared suddenly, the trail giving way to slick sandstone angled upward at 45 degrees. Water still ran down the grooves from the previous night's storm, making the surface treacherous. I didn't hesitate. I attacked the slope immediately, digging the toes of my boots into the carved channels, using my hands wherever necessary for balance. The burn in my legs went from uncomfortable to agonizing within seconds. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes, mixing with the sand and grit that covered everything. The sun beat down through the narrow gap between the canyon walls, and the air felt thick enough to choke on. Halfway up, I had to stop. Not to rest. Stopping felt impossible, but to look back, I needed to know. He stood at the base of the climb, face angled upward toward me. For several seconds, he didn't move. Then he stepped onto the incline. His foot slid backward immediately. The mud caking his boots and jeans provided no traction on the wet sandstone. He tried again, leaning farther forward, and slid back once more. I didn't wait to see if he'd keep trying. I turned and pushed upward, muscles screaming, lungs burning, refusing to stop until I reached the shelf. The narrow ledge offered just enough space to stand, maybe 8 feet wide. From there, the switchback trail led to the rim, steep, exposed, sections where the drop beside the path went straight down to the canyon floor hundreds of feet below, but it was a way out. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to force air into my lungs. When I could breathe again, I looked down one final time. He stood at the bottom, motionless, head still angled upward, watching. The switchbacks tested everything I had left. Sharp turns, loose gravel that shifted under every step, sections where the trail clung to the canyon wall with nothing but air beside it. My legs shook violently, threatening to give out with each stride, but I forced them to keep moving. By the time I saw the rim road ahead, black asphalt shimmering in the heat, I could barely stand. I staggered onto the pavement and sat down hard, pack still strapped to my shoulders, boots leaving red clay prints on the road surface. Late afternoon sun hung low in the west when a park maintenance truck approached. A ranger named Gerald Whitehorse stepped out, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to concern when he saw my condition. "You're the seasonal worker, right? From the White House Trail?" I nodded, still too winded to speak. He helped me into the truck, turned up the air conditioning, handed me a water bottle. As we drove toward the station, I told him what I'd seen: the crouched figure, the wrong movements, the pursuit through the mud. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "That section of trail, you're not the first to report something there. Past few summers, we've had workers quit without filing their exit reports. Some won't discuss what happened. Others wish they'd kept silent. 2 weeks later, I submitted my resignation. I left the reason section blank on the paperwork. Thomas B. Gay didn't push for details, just shook my hand and wished me well. On my drive out through Chinle, afternoon clouds built over the canyon walls, dark and promising another storm. At a pullout overlooking the canyon, I stopped one last time. Far below, where the walls narrowed and the trail bent toward the boulder, something stood perfectly still, watching the water flow past. I got back in my car and drove away. I haven't been back since, and when people ask about my summer in Arizona, I tell them about the heat, the storms, and the incredible beauty of the canyon walls. I don't tell them about anything else, because some things are better left unacknowledged. Some encounters don't have explanations, and some trails are best left to others. The canyon keeps its secrets. I've kept mine. My name is Arthur Turner, and I am 74 years old. For the past 5 years, I've been working as a park ranger at Whispering Pines State Park in northern Minnesota. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but it suits me just fine. Most days I spend my time making sure visitors follow the rules, picking up trash, and occasionally helping out lost hikers. The peace and quiet of the forest feels like home to me now. But there was one day, about 2 years ago, when something happened that shook me to my core. It's a story I've told very few people, partly because I'm not sure anyone would believe me, and partly because I'm still trying to make sense of it myself. It was early October, and the air had that crisp chill that heralds the coming of winter. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the forest in a palette of reds, oranges, and golds. I was working the morning shift, which meant I was up before dawn, ready to start my rounds as the sun peeked over the horizon. Whispering Pines isn't one of those big famous national parks that draw tourists from all over the country. It's a smaller, state-run affair, mostly frequented by locals who appreciate its quiet beauty and well-maintained trails. After 5 years on the job, I knew every inch of those woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. My first task that morning was to check the perimeter fence on the north side of the park. It was about a 2-mile hike from the ranger station, but I didn't mind. The walk gave me time to wake up properly and enjoy the crisp morning air. I had my thermos of coffee in one hand and my radio in the other, ready to call in if I found any damage or signs of trespassers. As I made my way along the fence line, a thick fog began to roll in. It wasn't unusual for this time of year, but it always made me a little uneasy. The way it muffled sounds and limited visibility, it was like walking through a world of cotton wool. I was about halfway through my inspection when I noticed something odd. A section of the fence, maybe 10 feet long, was completely mangled. It wasn't just broken or cut. It looked like something had torn through it with incredible force. The metal links were twisted and bent, and there were deep gouges in the wooden posts. I frowned, examining the damage more closely. This wasn't the work of any animal I knew. Bears could do some damage, sure. But this looked more like someone had taken a giant can opener to the fence, and it didn't look like typical vandalism either. There was something deliberate about it. I keyed my radio. "Hey, Marge, you there?" Marge Olson, my colleague and closest friend at the park, responded almost immediately. "Morning, Arthur. What's up?" "I found some strange damage on the north fence. Looks like something tore right through it. Any reports of unusual activity or large animal sightings?" There was a pause before Marge replied. "Negative on both counts. You think it might be vandals?" I hesitated. "I'm not sure. It doesn't look quite right for that. I'm going to investigate a bit further. Might take me a while to get back." "Roger that, Arthur. Be careful out there, and keep me posted." I clipped the radio back to my belt and took a deep breath. The sensible thing would have been to wait for backup, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow the trail of destruction, hoping it would lead me to some answers. As I stepped through the mangled fence, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was colder on this side, the fog thicker somehow. The usual sounds of the forest, bird song, rustling leaves, the occasional scurrying of small animals, were conspicuously absent. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. I walked for about a quarter of a mile, following a trail of broken branches and disturbed earth. The fog made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, and more than once I nearly lost the trail. But then I stumbled into a small clearing, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, or what remained of one. 2 tents lay in tatters, shredded beyond repair. Camping gear was strewn everywhere. Sleeping bags, backpacks, cooking equipment, and there was blood. Not a lot, but enough to know that someone had been hurt. My heart was pounding now, a mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through my veins. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of the campers, but the clearing was deserted. With shaking hands, I reached for my radio again. "Marge, I found something. A campsite, completely destroyed. There's..." Marge's voice came back, tight with concern. "Jesus, Arthur. Are there any victims? Do you need me to call for backup?" I took another look around the clearing. No sign of anyone yet. Let me check for clues before we call this in. Might be nothing. "Arthur, this doesn't sound like nothing. Be careful, okay?" I promised I would, and started to examine the campsite more closely. The tents were beyond saving, but I managed to find a backpack that was mostly intact. Inside was a map of the park, some energy bars, and a wallet. The ID inside belonged to a Mark Jensen from Minneapolis. I made a mental note of the name, thinking we'd need to contact his family. As I was zipping up the backpack, something caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the fog, was a set of tracks leading deeper into the woods. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, too large to be human, but clearly bipedal. Each print was nearly 2 feet long, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of elongated toes. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back, to radio for help and wait for backup. But if there were injured campers out there, every minute could count. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the tracks. The trail led me deeper into a part of the forest I'd rarely visited. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. The fog seemed to cling to everything, turning the world into a gray, formless void. I could barely see the tracks now, relying more on intuition than sight to stay on the trail. I'm not sure how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that mist-shrouded forest. But eventually, I emerged into another clearing, smaller than the first. In the center stood an enormous oak tree, its trunk easily 10 feet in diameter. The tree looked ancient, its bark gnarled and twisted into shapes that almost resembled faces. At the base of the tree, I found more blood and what looked like scraps of torn clothing. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I moved closer to the tree, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog. That's when I saw it. Crouched at the base of the tree was something. At first glance it looked almost human, but as my eyes adjusted I realized how wrong that initial impression was. The thing was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. Its skin was a mottled gray, like the bark of a dead tree, and seemed to shift and ripple as if it couldn't quite decide on a solid form. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They were huge, taking up far too much of its face, and so dark they seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. As those eyes locked onto mine, I felt a chill that went beyond mere physical cold. It was as if something fundamental had been taken from me, some essential part of my humanity stripped away in an instant. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. Then, faster than I could blink, it moved. One moment it was crouched by the tree, the next it was gone, disappearing into the forest with a speed that defied belief. The fog seemed to swallow it up, leaving no trace behind. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. And yet I knew with a bone-deep certainty that it had been real. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Arthur? Arthur, come in. You've been silent for over an hour. What's going on?" With trembling hands, I raised the radio to my mouth. "Marge, I saw something. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't natural. I'm heading back now." "Arthur, you're scaring me. Just come back to the station. We'll call in the authorities and sort this out." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, no longer caring about stealth or tracking. I just wanted to get as far away from that clearing as I could. The fog seemed to clutch at me, branches reaching out to snag my clothes, but I pushed through it all. By the time I made it back to the ranger station, I was gasping for breath, my lungs burning. Marge was waiting for me, her face pale with worry. "Arthur, what happened out there? You look like you've seen a ghost." I collapsed into a chair, trying to catch my breath. "I don't know, Marge. Something attacked that campsite, and I think it hurt someone. I followed the tracks, and I saw something, but it wasn't human. It couldn't have been human." Marge's expression was a mix of concern and disbelief. "We need to call this in, Arthur, now." The next few hours passed in a blur. We reported the incident to the local sheriff's department, who organized a search team to investigate. They found the campsite just as I'd described it, and even some of the strange tracks I'd followed. But there was no sign of the creature I'd seen, nor any trace of the missing campers. The search went on for days, with teams combing every inch of the park. They found Mark Jensen's car in the parking lot, confirming that he and at least one other person had been in the park. But beyond that, it was as if they had vanished into thin air. I was questioned repeatedly by the sheriff's department and later by state investigators. I told them everything I'd seen, holding nothing back. I could tell from their expressions that they didn't believe me, at least not about the creature. They were more inclined to think that I'd stumbled upon some kind of animal attack and that the stress and fog had played tricks on my mind. After a week of fruitless searching, the official investigation was scaled back. The incident was classified as a missing persons case, with animal attack listed as a possible cause. Whispering Pines was closed to the public pending a full review of safety protocols. In the weeks that followed, I found myself struggling to come to terms with what had happened. I replayed the events of that day over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of something that defied all logic. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Or had fear and fog combined to create some kind of hallucination? Marge and I were reassigned to administrative duties while the park remained closed. One evening, about a month after the incident, we were having a drink at O'Malley's, the local bar where most of the park staff hung out. The conversation, as it often did these days, drifted back to that fateful day. "You really think it was some kind of creature?" Marge asked, nursing her beer. "Not just a bear or something?" I shook my head.
I know what I saw, Marge. It wasn't any animal I've ever encountered. It was something else. Something that doesn't belong in our world.
Marge was quiet for a moment, then spoke in a low voice. "You know, there are stories about these woods. Old stories passed down by the Native American tribes that used to live here. They talk about a creature they called the Wendigo." I raised an eyebrow. "Wendigo? Isn't that some kind of cannibal spirit?" She nodded. "In some versions, yeah. But in others it's described as a malevolent spirit of the forest. Tall, gaunt, with eyes that can steal a person's soul. Sound familiar?" A chill ran down my spine. "You believe in that stuff?" Marge shrugged. "I didn't. But after what happened, I don't know, Arthur. Maybe there's some truth to the old legends." The idea of the Wendigo stuck with me, and over the next few weeks I found myself researching Native American folklore whenever I had the chance. The stories varied, but they all described a similar creature. Tall, otherworldly, and terrifying. A hunter that preyed on the unwary, particularly those who ventured too far into its domain. Whispering Pines reopened to the public about 2 months after the incident. New safety measures were put in place, including a buddy system for hikers and more frequent patrols. Marge and I were back on regular duty, but things were never quite the same. Every time I walked through those woods, I felt like I was being watched. The shadows seemed deeper, the silences more oppressive. I never saw the creature again, but the memory of those dark, soul-piercing eyes haunted my dreams. As the years passed, the incident faded from public memory. The case of the missing campers remained unsolved. Just another mystery to be speculated about around campfires. But for those of us who were there, who saw the aftermath and felt the lingering presence of something ancient and malevolent, the forest would never be the same. I'm retiring next month, hanging up my ranger hat for good. Marge keeps telling me I should write a book about my experiences, but I'm not sure the world is ready for that story. Some things I've come to believe are better left in the shadows. But as I prepare to leave Whispering Pines for the last time, I can't help but wonder, what really happened that foggy October morning? What was the true nature of the creature I encountered? And most chillingly of all, is it still out there, waiting in the dark heart of the forest for its next unsuspecting victim? I don't have answers to these questions, and perhaps I never will. But I do know one thing for certain. The woods aren't as safe as they seem. There are things out there, things we don't understand, and perhaps were never meant to. And sometimes, it's better to leave them be, undisturbed in their ancient slumber. As for me, I'll be content to spend my retirement far from the deep woods, where the only shadows I need to worry about are those cast by the setting sun on my porch. But on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I'll think back to that day in Whispering Pines, and I'll wonder about the secrets that still lurk in the heart of the forest. My name is George Wallace, and I am 68 years old. This is a true story about something that happened to me a few years back when I was working as a park ranger at Sleeping Giant State Park in Connecticut. I had been a ranger for nearly 20 years at that point, and I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing prepared me for what happened that autumn. It was a chilly October evening, and I had just finished a long day of patrolling the trails and making sure the campgrounds were clear of litter. The park was quiet, as it usually was this time of year, with only a few campers braving the cold nights. I was looking forward to a warm meal and maybe a beer or two before heading to bed. Around 8 p.m. I got a call on my radio. It was Sarah, one of the newer rangers. She sounded panicked, her voice shaky. She told me there was something weird going on at the northwest edge of the park, near the old quarry. Sarah was usually level-headed, so her distress worried me. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and my old Glock 19 just in case. I drove my Jeep through the winding park roads. the headlights cutting through the dense fog that had settled in. I could see the old quarry's silhouette in the distance, a gaping wound in the side of the mountain. As I got closer, I noticed Sarah's Jeep parked haphazardly on the side of the road, its lights still on, but Sarah was nowhere to be seen. I called out for her, but there was no response. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I started to get a bad feeling in my gut. I decided to check the quarry, thinking maybe Sarah had gone inside to investigate something. The place had a reputation for being dangerous, especially at night. As I approached the entrance to the quarry, I noticed something odd. There were strange markings on the ground, like someone had been dragging something heavy. The marks led into the quarry, and despite every instinct telling me to turn back, I followed them. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of moss and wet stone. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the rocky walls. I called out again, louder this time. "Sarah, you in here?" No answer. I moved deeper into the quarry, my hand on my gun. The dragging marks led to a narrow crevice in the rock face, a place I had never noticed before. The opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed forward. The crevice opened up into a small cavern. The air here was different, colder, and with a strange metallic smell. My flashlight beam caught something reflective on the far wall. As I moved closer, I realized it was some kind of symbol etched into the rock. It looked ancient, a series of interlocking circles and lines that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I heard a faint noise like a whimper coming from deeper in the cave. I moved forward cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I rounded a corner, I saw Sarah huddled against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. "George, thank God," she croaked. "We need to get out of here, now." I was about to ask her what happened when I heard another sound. This one much closer. It was a low guttural noise, almost like an animal growling, but with an unnatural metallic edge to it. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the shadows was a figure, tall and humanoid, but with features that were all wrong. Its skin seemed to shift and ripple, sometimes looking like polished metal, other times like rough stone. Its eyes glowed with an eerie blue light, and where its mouth should have been, there was only a dark void. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I fired my gun, the noise deafening in the confined space. The creature let out a shriek that sounded like grinding metal and lunged at me. I dodged to the side and fired again, this time hitting it square in the chest. It staggered back but didn't fall. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the shadows, disappearing from sight. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed Sarah and we ran, stumbling through the dark cave and out into the quarry. The fog had thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We made it to my Jeep, and I practically threw Sarah into the passenger seat before jumping in myself. I floored it, driving as fast as I dared through the winding park roads. Back at the ranger station, I called for an ambulance and tried to get Sarah to tell me what happened. Between gasps for breath, she told me she had seen strange lights in the quarry and went to investigate. That's when she encountered the creature. It had chased her into the cave where she had hidden until I found her. The ambulance arrived and they took Sarah to the hospital. I filed my report, but I knew no one would believe the truth. I barely believed it myself. Over the next few days, I searched the park for any signs of the creature but found nothing. It was like it had vanished into thin air. Sarah recovered from her injuries, but she was never the same. She left the Park Service and moved to a different state, wanting to put as much distance between herself and Sleeping Giant as possible. I stayed on, but I was more cautious, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for that strange metallic sound. I never saw the creature again, but every time I passed the old quarry, I felt its presence lurking just out of sight. I started calling it the Stone Shifter, a name that seemed to fit. I did some research and found old stories, legends about strange beings that lived in the mountains, neither fully flesh nor stone. Most people dismissed them as myths, but I knew better. About a year later, I was patrolling the park when I saw a light in the distance. It was coming from the direction of the quarry. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't been back there since that night with Sarah, but something compelled me to go now. I drove as close as I could and then continued on foot, moving quietly through the trees. The light was still there, a strange pulsing blue glow. As I got closer, I saw a figure standing near the entrance to the quarry. It was an old man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes fixed on the glowing symbol I had seen in the cave. The symbol was now visible on the rock face outside, pulsing with that eerie blue light. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked into the quarry. I followed, my hand on my gun. Inside, the air was charged with a strange energy that made my skin tingle. The old man was standing by the crevice that led to the cave, looking into it with a mixture of fear and longing. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked, my voice echoing in the empty space. He turned to look at me, and I saw his eyes were the same glowing blue as the symbol. "They're coming back," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "The old ones are waking up." Before I could respond, there was a flash of blue light, and the old man was gone. In his place stood the stone shifter, its form rippling and changing in the pulsing light. It reached out towards me with a hand that was sometimes flesh, sometimes stone, sometimes living metal. I backed away, my heart racing. I knew I was facing something beyond my understanding, something that had been here long before humans and would likely be here long after we were gone. The stone shifter didn't advance. Instead, it seemed to be waiting, watching. I left the quarry that night and never went back. I continued working as a ranger until my retirement, but I avoided that part of the park and I made sure others did too. The stone shifter and the mystery of the glowing symbol remained unexplained, and I was content to keep it that way. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I can hear a faint metallic whisper carried on the breeze, and I wonder what ancient secrets are still sleeping in the heart of the mountain waiting to wake up. I had always preferred the solitude of the outdoors, where the noise of civilization fell away and it was just me against the wilderness. Growing up in Kentucky, I spent most of my childhood exploring the thick forests and climbing the rugged hills that surrounded our small town. There's something primal about being alone out there, a sense of survival that strips everything down to the essentials. You move with purpose because you have to, and there's no one to rely on but yourself. My name is James Hawkins, and at 32 years old, I'd thought I'd seen everything these woods had to offer. I'd hiked most of the trails in the state, camped in places where you could go days without seeing another soul, and even had a few close calls with wildlife. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the Daniel Boone National Forest. This year, I decided to tackle a particularly remote section of the forest. I'd heard stories about the place, whispers among locals of strange occurrences, missing hikers, but I never put much stock in those tales. It was just talk, something people made up to entertain themselves around campfires. So I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and drove out to the forest, aiming to lose myself in its vastness for a few days. The night before my hike, I stayed at a small motel on the outskirts of a town called Pine Creek. It was one of those places that seemed frozen in time, with faded wallpaper and a flickering neon sign that buzzed incessantly. As I was checking in, the old man behind the counter eyed my backpack and hiking boots. "Heading into the forest, are you?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. I nodded, expecting the usual warnings about bears or getting lost. The old man leaned in close, his roomy eyes fixed on mine. "You be careful out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's things in those woods that ain't natural, things that don't take kindly to visitors." I smiled politely, chalking it up to small-town superstition. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the distant howl of what I assumed was a coyote, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The morning air was crisp, the sun barely touching the tops of the trees as I began my hike. I'd mapped out a route that would take me deep into the forest, far from the marked trails. That's where I felt most at peace, where the chances of running into another soul were slim to none. As I shouldered my pack and set off down the overgrown path, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with a touch of apprehension. The forest loomed before me, ancient and inscrutable, its depths holding secrets that had yet to be uncovered. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The forest was alive, teeming with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. I made good time, the familiar rhythm of walking soothing any lingering nerves from the night before. About 4 hours into the hike, I found myself at the base of a steep incline. The rocks were slick with morning dew, and the climb promised to be a challenging one. I paused, taking a moment to appreciate the stillness before beginning the ascent. It was tougher than I'd anticipated. Each step a calculated move to avoid slipping. The rocks were sharp, some loose, and more than once I found myself scrambling for purchase as my foot slid on the treacherous surface. But the challenge was invigorating, a reminder of why I was out here in the first place. Sweat dripped into my eyes and my muscles burned with the effort, but I pressed on. As I neared the top, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest, which had been a constant backdrop to my climb, had begun to fade. By the time I reached the summit, an eerie silence had fallen. I stood atop the ridge, the forest sprawling out below me like an endless green sea. I took a deep breath, the air fresher up here, and felt a sense of accomplishment. But that feeling was quickly overshadowed by a growing sense of unease. The forest had gone quiet, the birds no longer singing, the wind no longer rustling through the leaves. It was as if the world was holding its breath. And then I saw it, a structure half hidden by the trees, just a little further along the ridge. It was an old cabin, dilapidated and forgotten, the kind of place that had no business being this deep in the forest. My rational mind told me to stay away, to continue on my planned route. But curiosity, that dangerous human trait, got the better of me. As I made my way towards the cabin, the silence seemed to deepen. My footsteps, the creak of my backpack, even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing all sound. The cabin grew larger as I approached, its weathered wood and broken windows a stark contrast to the vibrant green of the surrounding forest. Standing before it, I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the day. There was something fundamentally wrong about this place, something that set every instinct on edge, but I had come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath to steady my nerves, I reached for the door. The door creaked loudly in protest as I pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The inside of the cabin was just as I expected, dusty, abandoned, with furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A thick layer of grime covered everything, but the air inside was different, heavy and oppressive, carrying a scent that was sweet and putrid at the same time. It clung to the walls, to the floorboards, to me. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, and I could feel the give in them, years of neglect having weakened the wood. The cabin was small, just one main room with a kitchen area, and a single cot pushed up against the far wall. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. The noise echoed through the cabin, but the door remained shut as if something had deliberately pushed it closed. I shook it off, chalking it up to the wind, though I knew that was unlikely. There wasn't even a breeze outside. Still, I wasn't about to let some old door spook me. I had come this far, and my curiosity was piqued. There were signs that someone had lived here once, long ago. Rusty pots and pans hung in the kitchen area, their surfaces mottled with age. A worn book lay on the cot, its pages yellowed and curled. As I moved further into the cabin, the floorboards continued to creak and groan. Each step felt like a violation, as if I was disturbing something that should have been left undisturbed. The air grew thicker, making it harder to breathe. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, though the interior of the cabin was cool. I made my way to the cot, drawn to the book that lay there. Carefully, I picked it up, brushing off layers of dust. It was a journal, its cover cracked and brittle with age. The leather binding felt oddly warm to the touch, almost alive. With trembling fingers, I opened the journal. The first few pages were mundane, recounting the daily life of whoever had lived here. There were weather observations, notes on hunting and fishing, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I flipped further, the entries became more erratic, more disjointed. The handwriting grew frantic, the words scrawled across the pages in a hurry. One entry caught my eye. Day 47. The noises are getting louder. They're in the walls now, scratching, always scratching. I tried to leave yesterday, but the forest, it changed. The paths I've walked 100 times led me in circles. Always back here, always back to this damned cabin. My heart was pounding now, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The air in the cabin felt thicker, harder to breathe. I wanted to put the journal down, to leave this place and never look back, but I couldn't stop reading. The last entry was almost illegible, the words barely more than frenzied scribbles. They're here, God help me, they're here, can't escape. It knows. If anyone finds this, don't stay. Run, run. The words trailed off into a scrawl that ran off the page, as if the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence, or dragged away. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. The oppressive silence of the cabin was broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I needed to leave, needed to get as far away from this place as possible. As I turned to go, something caught my eye. Movement in the corner of the room, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. I froze, my mind racing, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Just my imagination playing tricks on me after reading that damn journal. But the shadow moved again, and this time I knew it wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it was coming closer. My instincts kicked in, and I backed up towards the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. I had to get out of there, had to get back to the safety of the open forest. But the handle wouldn't budge, as if the door was sealed shut. Panic set in, my breath coming in short, rapid gasps. The shadow was almost upon me, and I could feel an intense heat radiating from it, like standing too close to a roaring fire. It seemed to absorb the light around it, a void in the shape of a man, but twisted, wrong. With a desperate shove, I threw myself against the door. For a moment it held, and I felt a surge of terror, as I imagined being trapped in this nightmare. Then, with a splintering crack, the door burst open, sending me sprawling onto the ground outside. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and took off running without looking back. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees becoming a blur as I tore through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging scratches, but I didn't slow down. I could feel it behind me, a presence that radiated malevolence. I didn't stop until my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were about to give out. Finally, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. As the panic began to subside, I tried to make sense of what had happened. It wasn't just fear that gripped me, but something deeper, something more primal. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to acknowledge that what I'd seen was real. But deep down I knew, something unnatural dwelled in that cabin, something that defied explanation. As my breathing began to slow, I became aware of the forest around me. The normal sounds had returned. Birds chirped, but then I heard it. A low rumbling sound, like something heavy. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just one thing, it was many, all moving together, all headed straight for me. The forest around me seemed to darken, as if the very light was being sucked away. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath coming out in visible puffs despite the summer heat. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied now by a chorus of low guttural growls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I forced myself to move, to run faster than I'd ever run in my life. My mind was in overdrive. Every fiber of my being focused on survival. I could hear them behind me now, crashing through the trees, their snarls and growls filling the air. I didn't dare look back, knowing that if I did, it would be the end of me. The forest floor was treacherous, roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step. But fear lent me a grace I'd never possessed before, my feet finding purchase where there seemed to be none. The sounds behind me grew closer, the air growing colder with their approach. I could feel their breath on the back of my neck, icy and fetid. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed in protest, but I pushed on. Suddenly, the trees began to thin. I burst out of the tree line, my truck just ahead, parked at the trailhead. It was like crossing a threshold. The moment I left the forest, the sounds of pursuit stopped abruptly. The air warmed, and the oppressive darkness lifted. But I didn't stop to question it. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the keys, almost dropping them. I could feel them at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. I knew that if I didn't get out of there quickly, they would come for me again. I finally got the door open, threw myself inside, and started the engine. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and I tore out of there like a bat out of hell. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something emerging from the tree line, a mass of writhing shadows that seemed to reach out towards the truck. But then I was around a bend, and the forest was lost from view. I drove for what felt like hours, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. When I finally stopped, I was miles from the forest, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. I sat there in the truck, trying to process what had happened, but my mind was a jumbled mess. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the road, I made a decision. I had to tell someone, had to warn them about that place. I couldn't let anyone else stumble upon that cabin, couldn't risk those things finding another victim. With shaking hands, I started the truck again and headed for the nearest ranger station. I didn't know if they would believe me, but I had to try. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Whatever I had encountered in that forest, whatever had chased me, it wasn't done with me yet. The lights of the ranger station appeared ahead, a beacon of normalcy in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly strange. I parked haphazardly, my mind still reeling from the events of the day. As I stepped out of the truck, I cast one last glance back towards the direction of the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows at the edge of the parking lot, a darkness deeper than the falling night, but when I blinked, it was gone. Taking a deep breath, I turned and walked towards the ranger station. Whatever happened next, I knew my life would never be the same. The horrors I had witnessed in Daniel Boone National Forest would haunt me forever, a constant reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the dark places waiting for the unwary. With a shaking hand, I reached for the door of the ranger station, ready to tell my story, hoping against hope that someone would believe me. Because if they didn't, if no one heeded my warning, I feared that what I had encountered in that forest would not remain confined to its shadowy domain for long. I burst into the ranger station, probably looking like a madman. My clothes were torn and dirty, scratches on my face and arms from my frantic run through the forest. The two rangers on duty looked up in alarm, hands instinctively moving towards their sidearms. "Easy there," one of them said, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard. "What's the trouble?" I tried to catch my breath, suddenly aware of how crazy my story was going to sound, but I had to tell them. I had to make them understand. "There's something out there," I gasped. "In the forest. Something not natural." The rangers exchanged glances. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, the unspoken assumption that I was just another hiker who'd gotten spooked by shadows and animal noises. But I pressed on. I told them everything, about the cabin, the journal, the shadow, the things that had chased me. As I spoke, the words tumbling out in a rush, I could see their expressions change from skepticism to concern, and then to something else, fear. At first they looked at me like I was crazy, but then something changed. The older ranger, the one with the salt and pepper beard, pulled me aside. His name tag read, Frank Morrison. "Son," he said, his voice low and grave. "I've heard similar stories over the years. People going missing in that part of the forest. Strange occurrences that couldn't be explained. Most folks around here won't go near that area." My heart raced. Someone believed me. Someone knew. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's out there?" Frank shook his head. "I don't know. Nobody does. But whatever it is, it's been there a long time. Longer than any of us." The other ranger, a younger man named Tom, joined us. "We should report this," he said, but Frank held up a hand. "Not yet. First, we need to check it out ourselves. If we call this in without any evidence, they'll think we're as crazy as one." He trailed off, glancing at me apologetically. I understood. It did sound crazy. Hell, if I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. "I'll take you there," I said, surprising myself with my own words. The last thing I wanted was to go back to that place, but I knew I had to. I had to prove I wasn't insane. Frank nodded. "We'll go at first light. For now, you should rest. You look like you've been through hell." They set me up in a small back room of the station. As I lay on the cot staring at the ceiling, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow in the cabin, felt the cold breath of whatever had chased me through the forest. Morning came too soon. We set out just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, the forest shrouded in mist. Frank, Tom, and I piled into a ranger vehicle, its four-wheel drive easily handling the rough terrain. As we neared the area where I had parked my truck the day before, a sense of dread settled over me. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less threatening, but I knew better. I knew what lurked in its depths. We hiked for hours, following my recollection of the path I had taken. The forest was alive with normal sounds, birds chirping, squirrels chattering. It was so different from the unnatural silence of yesterday that I began to doubt myself. Had I imagined it all? But then we reached the ridge, and I saw it. The cabin stood just as I remembered, weathered and foreboding. Frank and Tom exchanged glances, their hands moving to their sidearms. "Stay alert," Frank muttered as we approached. The door of the cabin hung open, swinging slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. Inside, everything was as I had left it, dusty, abandoned. The air thick with that sweet, rotting smell. "The journal," I said, moving towards the cot. It was right here. But the cot was empty. The journal was gone. Frank frowned, his eyes scanning the room. "Are you sure this is the place?" I nodded vigorously. "Yes, I'm certain. The journal was here. And there," I pointed to the corner, "that's where I saw the shadow." Tom was examining the door frame. "There are scratches here," he said. "Deep ones, like something was trying to get in, or out." Frank joined him, running his fingers over the marks. "These aren't animal scratches," he murmured. "What the hell made these?" A chill ran down my spine. I opened my mouth to suggest we leave, when suddenly, the temperature in the cabin dropped dramatically. Our breath came out in visible puffs, and then we heard it, the low rumbling sound, the same one I had heard yesterday. It was coming from outside, from the forest, and it was getting closer. Frank's face went pale. "Back to the vehicle," he said, his voice tight with fear. Now, we didn't need to be told twice. We burst out of the cabin, running headlong into the forest. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of trees cracking and falling. As we ran, I chanced to look back. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. A wave of darkness was moving through the forest behind us, consuming everything in its path. Trees vanished into it. The very light seemed to be sucked away. We reached the Ranger vehicle, piling in as Frank gunned the engine. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and we shot forward just as the wave of darkness reached the edge of the clearing. In the rearview mirror, I watched as the darkness seemed to pause at the tree line, roiling and churning like a living thing. Then, slowly, it retreated back into the forest. We drove in silence, each of us trying to process what we had seen. Finally, Tom spoke up. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice shaking. Frank's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "We tell them," he said grimly. "We tell them everything, and we make sure no one ever goes into that part of the forest again." As we sped away from Daniel Boone National Forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of whatever dark secret lurked in those woods, and I feared that one day it might not be content to stay hidden in the shadows. The days that followed our encounter in the forest were a blur of debriefings, official reports, and sleepless nights. Frank, Tom, and I were questioned repeatedly by various government agencies, each one more skeptical than the last. But the evidence was undeniable. The claw marks on the cabin, the inexplicable cold spots, and the footage from the dashboard camera of the Ranger vehicle that had captured a glimpse of the darkness pursuing us. The Daniel Boone National Forest was partially closed to the public, with the official story citing environmental concerns and unstable terrain. But those of us who knew the truth understood the real reason. Whatever was out there in those woods, it was better left undisturbed. I couldn't shake the memories of what I'd experienced. The shadow in the cabin, the chase through the forest, the wave of darkness that had nearly engulfed us. These images played on repeat in my mind, robbing me of sleep and peace. I found myself jumping at shadows, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. A month after the incident, I received a call from Frank. His voice was tight with tension as he spoke. "James, you need to come to the station. There's something you should see." When I arrived, Frank and Tom were huddled around a computer, their faces pale and drawn. On the screen was a grainy image from a trail camera, the kind used by hunters to track game. What I saw made my blood run cold. The photo showed a section of the forest near where we had encountered the cabin. But the trees were wrong, twisted and blackened as if burned, though no fire had been reported. And at the edge of the frame, barely visible, was a shape, a darkness deeper than the shadows around it, vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite define. "This was taken yesterday," Frank said quietly. "Whatever's out there, it's spreading." The implications were terrifying. The entity, or entities that we had encountered, weren't content to remain in their small corner of the forest. They were expanding their territory. Over the next few weeks, more evidence emerged. Hikers reported strange noises and unexplained cold spots in areas of the forest that had previously been unaffected. Wildlife seemed to be fleeing the area in droves, and the darkness in the trail camera photos appeared in more and more locations, always just at the edge of perception, as if taunting us with its presence. Despite the mounting evidence, official channels remained skeptical. The forest remained open, though warnings were posted about avoiding certain areas. It wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't enough. It was 3 months after my initial encounter when I made the decision to go back. I couldn't explain why, even to myself. Perhaps it was a need for closure, or maybe some part of me felt drawn to the darkness we had awakened. Whatever the reason, I found myself once again driving towards Daniel Boone National Forest, my truck loaded with camping gear and, this time, a few items for protection: salt, iron filings, and other things recommended by the more esoteric websites I'd been frequenting. Frank and Tom had tried to talk me out of it, but in the end they understood. They made me promise to check in every few hours and gave me an emergency beacon to activate if things went south. As I hiked into the forest, I could feel the change immediately. The air was heavier, the silence more pronounced. Even in areas that should have been teeming with life, there was an unnatural stillness. I made camp a few miles from where I estimated the cabin to be, not willing to venture too close as night fell. As darkness descended, the forest came alive with sounds, but not the normal nocturnal noises of animals and insects. These were different, otherworldly. Whispers just at the edge of hearing, scraping sounds from the trees around me, and occasionally a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I huddled in my tent, my hand clasped around the emergency beacon, debating whether to activate it. But as the night wore on, the sounds gradually faded, replaced by an eerie silence. When morning came, I broke camp and continued deeper into the forest. The trees became more twisted and malformed. The further I went, their bark blackened and peeling. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy and unnatural. And then I saw it, the cabin. But it was different now. The wood had darkened, seeming to absorb the light around it. The door hung open, revealing only darkness inside. As I stood there trying to summon the courage to approach, I heard a voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to reverberate inside my own head. "You came back," it said, its tone a mixture of amusement and hunger. "We knew you would." I wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of civilization, but I stood my ground. "What are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. The darkness around the cabin seemed to deepen, to coalesce into a shape. It was the shadow I had seen before, but larger now, more defined. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were pinpricks of absolute blackness. "We are the forgotten," the voice said, "the ones who were here before, and now we are awakening." As it spoke, I felt a pull, an almost irresistible urge to step forward, to let the darkness envelop me. I resisted, my hand fumbling for the iron filings in my pocket. The shadow tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture. "Your trinkets cannot harm us," it said. "But your fear feeds us. It makes us stronger." I realized then the terrible truth. Every expedition into the forest, every investigation, every moment of terror experienced by those who ventured too close, it had all been feeding this thing, helping it grow stronger. "Why are you here?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" The shadow seemed to grow, encompassing more of the clearing. "To reclaim what was once ours," it said. "This world, your world, it belongs to us." With those words, it lunged forward. I turned to run, but the forest around me had changed. The trees were closing in, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. The ground beneath my feet became soft and yielding, threatening to swallow me whole. I fumbled for the emergency beacon, finally managing to activate it. As its signal pulsed into the air, I heard the shadow laugh, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "They cannot save you," it said. "No one can." As the darkness closed in around me, I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard the roar of engines, saw flashes of light through my eyelids. I opened my eyes to see several ranger vehicles bursting into the clearing, their headlights cutting through the unnatural darkness. Frank and Tom were there, along with a team of people in hazmat suits. The shadow retreated, but not before I heard its final words in my mind. "This isn't over. We will return." As the Rangers loaded me into one of the vehicles, I looked back at the cabin. It was gone, as if it had never existed. In its place was nothing but undisturbed forest. In the weeks that followed, the government finally took action. A large section of Daniel Boone National Forest was cordoned off, declared a restricted area under the guise of an ecological research project. Teams of scientists and specialists combed the forest, setting up monitoring equipment and conducting tests I could only guess at. I was debriefed extensively, my every experience in the forest dissected and analyzed. They were particularly interested in my final encounter, in the words the shadow had spoken, to reclaim what was once ours. The implications were staggering. Frank, Tom, and I were sworn to secrecy, though we were kept in the loop about the ongoing containment efforts. The entity, or entities, seemed to have retreated deeper into the forest, but their presence could still be felt. The restricted area remained a dead zone. No plant or animal life, no insects, not even bacteria in the soil. It was as if that part of the forest had been entirely drained of life. Months passed, and slowly, life began to return to normal. Or as normal as it could be when you knew what lurked in the shadows of the world. I found myself unable to enjoy the outdoors like I used to. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, seemed to hide potential threats. It's been a year since my last encounter in Daniel Boone National Forest. The official story is that the restricted area is showing signs of recovery, that whatever environmental disaster had occurred there is slowly being remedied. But I know the truth. I still receive updates from Frank. The entity or entities are still there, contained but not defeated. The border of the dead zone fluctuates, sometimes expanding, sometimes contracting. It's an ongoing battle, one fought in secret by people most of the world will never know about. As for me, I've left Kentucky. I couldn't bear to be so close to those woods anymore. I've settled in a small town in the Midwest, as far from large forests as I could get. But even here, in the heart of farm country, I can't escape the memories. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up in a cold sweat, certain that I can hear that low rumbling growl. In my darkest moments, I wonder if what I encountered in those woods followed me here. If it's just biding its time, waiting for the right moment to emerge. I try to tell myself that it's just paranoia, that the horrors I witnessed are confined to that small section of Daniel Boone National Forest. But deep down, I know the truth. What I encountered there was just the beginning. There are things in this world, ancient and powerful things, that exist in the shadows of our reality, and one day, they may decide to step into the light. Until then, I remain vigilant. I watch the shadows, listen for sounds that don't belong, and I remember the words spoken by that entity in the forest. This isn't over, we will return. I can only hope that when that day comes, we'll be ready. My name is Jack Phillips, and I'm 61 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened a few years back when I was still a park ranger at Whispering Pines State Forest in northern Michigan. Now, I wasn't new to the job. I'd been patrolling the trails and keeping an eye out for lost hikers for over 2 decades. It's not the kind of gig you do for the money, but more for the love of the outdoors and the peace it brings. My friends used to joke that I should have been born a century earlier, out there trapping and exploring like the old mountain men. Whispering Pines was a vast expanse of towering evergreens, crystal clear lakes, and rugged terrain. It attracted thousands of visitors each year, from casual day trippers to hardcore backpackers looking to test their mettle against nature. I'd seen it all over the years, lost kids, injured hikers, and even the occasional bear encounter, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that autumn. It started innocently enough. Late September brought a chill to the air and painted the forest in a breathtaking array of reds, oranges, and golds. Tourists flocked to the park to witness the spectacle, and we rangers were kept busy ensuring everyone stayed safe and followed the rules. My partner, Ellen Rodriguez, and I had just finished our morning briefing when the first report came in. Jack, Ellen, our supervisor, Frank Mulligan, called out as we were heading to our patrol vehicles. Got a missing hiker reported near Beaver Creek. Family says he went out yesterday afternoon and never made it back to the campsite. Can you two check it out? It wasn't an unusual request. Hikers sometimes got turned around or decided to camp out an extra night without letting anyone know. Ellen and I headed out, expecting a routine search and rescue operation. We found the missing hiker, Tom Bradshaw, about 3 miles off the main trail. He was dehydrated and a bit scratched up, but otherwise fine. What struck me as odd was his insistence that he'd been chased off the trail by something he couldn't quite describe. "It was big, Jack," Tom said, his eyes wide and voice trembling. "Bigger than any bear I've ever seen. And fast. God, it was so fast." I chalked it up to dehydration and fear playing tricks on his mind. We got him back to his family and thought that was the end of it. But it was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, we had an unusual spike in reports about people going missing. Now, that's not entirely unheard of. Folks get lost or injured, and sometimes they wander off the trails thinking they're invincible. But this was different. The disappearances weren't adding up, and the unease in the community was palpable. I remember joking to Ellen one crisp October morning. Maybe Bigfoot's finally decided to vacation in Michigan. But deep down, I was worried. Something didn't feel right in the forest I'd called home for so long. It all came to a head on a brisk late October day. The air was crisp, and the leaves were a fiery palette of reds and oranges. I was supposed to meet up with Ellen for a routine check of the trails. We always split up and covered different sections to make the rounds quicker. That day, I was assigned to the northern part of the forest, an area not frequented much by tourists. Ellen didn't show up at our usual meeting spot. I waited for a good hour, thinking she might have gotten caught up with something. I tried calling her on the radio, but there was no response. So I figured I'd start without her. She was probably fine, I told myself. Maybe helping a lost hiker or dealing with some minor emergency. I was about 2 hours into my patrol when I noticed something off. There was this smell. Something putrid and metallic like rusted iron mixed with decaying leaves. My first thought was maybe an animal had died nearby, but the forest has its way of cleaning up after itself. This smell was different, almost unnatural. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the scent. After all, it's part of my job to check for anything out of the ordinary. I found a small clearing, and that's where I saw it. Ellen's ranger hat was on the ground, covered in what looked like blood. My heart dropped into my stomach. There was no sign of Ellen, just the hat and a few scattered tools she usually carried. This wasn't a simple case of getting lost. Something bad had happened. I radioed for backup, but the response was crackly and full of static. Vance, trail, need, was all I could make out. I had no choice but to investigate further. I felt a sense of dread creeping in, but I pushed it aside. Ellen was out there, and she needed help. I followed a faint trail of blood leading deeper into the woods. My mind raced through 100 different scenarios, none of them good. The trail led me to an old rundown cabin. I knew about this place. It was abandoned years ago and left to rot. No one ever came out here, not even the most adventurous hikers. The door was ajar, and inside it was dark, the kind of darkness that eats up the daylight. I called out for Ellen, but there was no response. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me like a wall. It was stronger here, almost suffocating. That's when I saw it. In the dim light filtering through the broken windows, I could make out a figure slumped in the corner. It was Ellen. Her body was mangled, almost unrecognizable, and there were deep gashes all over her. I felt a wave of nausea but forced it down. I had to stay focused. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard a noise from behind me. I turned around, and there it was. The creature. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, with long limbs and pale, almost translucent skin. Its eyes were the most unsettling part, black and void-like, as if looking into nothingness. It didn't move at first, just stood there, staring at me. I reached for my sidearm, but the creature lunged before I could draw it. The next few moments were a blur of terror and adrenaline. The thing was unnaturally quick. It swiped at me with claws that seemed to extend from its fingers, tearing through my jacket and into my flesh. Somehow, I managed to land a hit on its arm with my flashlight, and it let out a sound that was more of a hiss than a scream. It recoiled, giving me just enough time to scramble out of the cabin and into the woods. I didn't look back, just ran as fast as I could, blood dripping from my wounds and adrenaline pumping through my veins. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. They told me a couple of hikers found me unconscious near one of the main trails and brought me in. My wounds were severe, but I was lucky to be alive. The official report said Ellen was attacked by a bear, but I knew better. I told them what I saw, but they dismissed it as shock and trauma. Who would believe a story like mine? A 7-foot-tall creature in the woods. It sounded insane even to me. I couldn't go back to the forest after that. I took a desk job with the State Parks Department in Lansing, away from the trees and the memories, but I never forgot. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, I think about Ellen and that creature. It's still out there, I'm sure of it. They never found any more bodies after that, and the disappearances stopped. Maybe it moved on, or maybe it's just waiting. I don't know. All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. The cabin was eventually torn down, and life in the nearby towns returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. People moved on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of it. That creature, whatever it was, left a mark on me, a reminder of the things that lurk in the dark corners of our world. Ellen's family deserved the truth, but how could I explain what really happened? They held a small memorial for her, and I attended, feeling like a fraud for not being able to save her. Her husband, Mike, looked at me with eyes full of questions I couldn't answer. Their 2 teenage kids, Sarah and Jake, stood silently by their father's side, their faces a mixture of grief and confusion. I tried to go back to my life, but the nightmares followed me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, reliving that moment in the cabin. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Amelia Chen, but even she seemed at a loss when I described the creature. Maybe it was a manifestation of your trauma, she suggested, but I knew what I saw was real. Months passed, and I settled into my new routine in Lansing. The desk job was mind-numbingly boring compared to my days as a ranger, but it was safe. No unexplained creatures, no life-or-death situations, just paperwork and meetings. I thought I was starting to move on, to put the horror behind me. Then, one night in late March, I got a call from another ranger, Marcus Johnson. He was an old friend, and one of the few people who didn't treat me like I was crazy after what happened. Marcus was now stationed at Whispering Pines, taking over my old position. "Jack," he said, his voice tense. "Something's happening here. A hiker's gone missing in the same area where you found Ellen. The search party found strange markings on the trees, and there's this smell, like iron and decay." I felt my blood run cold. I knew then that it was back, or maybe it had never left. I told Marcus to be careful and hung up the phone, my heart heavy with dread. I knew I couldn't stay away any longer. I owed it to Ellen, to the missing hiker, and to everyone who set foot in those woods. Against my better judgment, I packed my gear, including a gun this time, and headed back to Whispering Pines. As I drove through the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a terrible idea, but I had to do it. I had to face it, whatever it was. I met up with Marcus at the ranger station just as dawn was breaking. The familiar smell of pine and damp earth brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad. Marcus filled me in on the details of the missing hiker, a 28-year-old woman named Allison Cooper, last seen 2 days ago near Beaver Creek. We set out to search the northern part of the forest, the area where I'd had my encounter months before. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. We reached the clearing where I'd found Ellen's hat, and that's when we saw it. The creature was there, standing in the shadows of the trees, watching us. Marcus raised his gun, but I knew it wouldn't be that easy. The creature moved with a speed that defied logic, and before I could react, it was upon us. Marcus fired, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. The creature slashed at him with its long, razor-sharp claws, and he went down with a scream. I aimed my gun and fired, hitting it in the chest. It staggered back, and I took the opportunity to grab Marcus and run. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail, where a group of early morning hikers found us and called for help. Marcus was in bad shape, but he survived. The creature had disappeared into the woods, leaving us with more questions than answers. The official report once again blamed a bear, but I knew the truth. The creature was still out there, waiting for its next victim. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I wrote down everything I remembered, every detail of both encounters, and sent it to the local paper, the Whispering Pines Gazette. To my surprise, they published my story. It caused quite a stir in the community. Some people believed me, sharing their own strange experiences in the forest. Others dismissed it as the ravings of a traumatized man. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that the truth was out there. The forest was no longer just a place of beauty and peace. It held secrets, dark and terrible, that needed to be exposed. I never went back to being a park ranger. The memories were too painful, the fear too real, but I found a new purpose. I started a support group for people who had experienced unexplained phenomena in the wilderness. We met twice a month in a small community center in Lansing. At first, it was just a handful of us, me, Marcus, once he recovered, and a few others who had read my story and reached out. But as word spread, our numbers grew. There was Lisa, a wildlife photographer who swore she'd seen something matching my description in the forests of northern Minnesota. And Tom, a retired geologist who had encountered strange, inexplicable phenomena during his expeditions in remote areas. Each story was different, but they all shared a common thread. The feeling that there was something out there, something beyond our understanding. I also started giving talks at local schools and community centers. Not about the creature specifically, but about wilderness safety and the importance of respecting nature. I couldn't bring myself to scare kids with tales of monsters, but I could teach them how to stay safe, how to be prepared, and most importantly, how to trust their instincts when something doesn't feel right. As the years passed, the memories of that night in the cabin never faded, but they became easier to bear. I found solace in helping others, and in knowing that I had done what I could to warn people about the dangers lurking in the wild places of the world. To this day, I still wonder what that creature was, and where it came from. Was it some kind of undiscovered species? A government experiment gone wrong? Or something even more inexplicable? I don't have the answers, and maybe I never will. But I do know this: the world is vast and mysterious, and there are things out there that defy explanation. My experience changed me forever, opened my eyes to a reality I never knew existed. And while I can't go back to the person I was before, I've found a way to move forward, to use my experience to help others, and maybe, just maybe, prevent someone else from going through what I did. As I sit here in my small apartment in Lansing, looking out at the city lights, I can't help but think of Whispering Pines. The forest is still there, still beautiful, still drawing visitors from all over. But now, when the wind blows through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth, I imagine I can hear something else, a whisper, a warning, a reminder that in the depths of the wilderness there are secrets best left undiscovered. And yet part of me knows that as long as that creature is out there, as long as there's a chance it might hurt someone else, I'll never truly be at peace. So I keep telling my story, keep helping those who've had similar experiences, and keep hoping that someday we'll understand what's really out there in the shadows of the forest. Until then, I'll be here, ready to listen, ready to help, and always watching the trees.